We talked a little bit more about, it seems like both parties have some common goals when it comes to China, whether it's addressing those trade imbalances, addressing national security concerns. But of course, the approach is very different. As Steve mentioned, there is an assumption that the Harris campaign is going to not stray too far from what we heard from Biden as well. Is that likely going to be the case?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Yvonne and David. Obviously, China will come up during the campaign. It has always come up in every presidential campaign. Each of the candidates will try to portray a tougher stance than the other. The problem with President Trump is, as your correspondent indicated, he's proposing up to 60% tariffs. That's a tax, 60% tax on all items coming from China. And in fact, not just coming from China, but tariffs or taxes on all goods coming from around the country. That's a tax on everyday consumers, whether you're buying clothes, a screwdriver, sporting goods, and household appliances. The Biden administration has been, while it has kept the Trump tariffs in place, it has been very strategic in making sure that China does not get a hold of things that it could use to strengthen its military. The Biden administration is restricting exports of high-tech goods, even the equipment to manufacture high-tech goods, restricting biologics going into China, AI, to make sure that these things cannot be used by the military or to suppress some of the populations with China. You're going to see Kamala Harris, if she's president, continuing that very strategic, targeted approach of getting tougher with China.
Professor, let me bring in Professor Shen. How is Kamala Harris viewed in China?
Well, most people don't know her well, and we try to understand her. And she is rolling out her policy if she would be elected, and but still avoid to be interviewed by the media. So my sense is that she somehow would carry on the legacy of current President Biden, namely competing with China while building a fence, building a guardrail not to have the relationship to derail. And also, I think she would not satisfy with the current policy. She would leave her fingerprint in the history, possibly by removing some unnecessary tariff that has been levied by the former president, and try to be exempted by the current president, but that has failed. Meantime, she may toughen U.S. trade policy in some strategically targeted area. So that's what I would expect.
Well, Professor, and as well, Ambassador, I want to put this next question to both of you. I'll give you a chance for both of you to answer. It's a very simple question for a very complex relationship. Can we read which candidate Beijing would prefer to have? They know Donald Trump. They've seen him in action for those 4 years, obviously. They don't, as you said, Professor Shen, know Kamala Harris very well. In fact, Kamala Harris only has met Xi Jinping, from my accounting, once, and that was at the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Bangkok. So she doesn't have a lot of experience. Is there one particular candidate in the policies that would be more preferred by Beijing?
Well, I don't think it's possible to get into the minds of the Chinese leaders, because each of the candidates have very different approaches to China, equally trying to be tough. But I think that the problem with Donald Trump's proposals is that it's not just an increase in tariffs on all Chinese goods coming into the United States, but tariffs on all items coming from around the world, whether Germany, Canada, Mexico, France, everything that Americans use, because so much of what Americans use on a daily basis comes from other countries. And if the Trump administration imposes these tariffs across the board, all these other countries will retaliate against American goods, making the American goods even more expensive, and that's going to cost Americans jobs.
Professor Shen, can you give us your take on that?
Well, pure my personal take, not Beijing's take. My view is that China is more sophisticated now than tens of years ago. That who is better than another person. And they are all American leaders. They all want to make America more prosperous and secure. And but in different category, for instance, in so-called democracy, Trump seems to be less caring about this. It's my personal view, not the old Chinese view. And he thinks Hong Kong is of China's sovereign issue, so why the U.S. should care that a lot. But I think Biden and Harris would take this issue differently. And Trump would beat China if China would not meet his target of making America great again, would not buy a lot. In short term, he would make China to lose face and substance. But the Democrats try to have a balance, while seeking that China would buy more, but also try to take some tariff away from what Trump has levied. But Biden is unable to successfully to achieve this. This is, in my personal view, his lack of leadership.
Professor Shen, how do you see China tackling a potential second Trump presidency or a Harris presidency? There's this assumption out there that China doesn't have that much runway to retaliate in some ways, but do you see it that way? And what could be really be the next kind of form of retaliation?
For tens of years, China tried to build a cordial partnership with the U.S. I think still it is in the mind of the Beijing leadership, to what I know. We want to cooperate with the U.S. We want to have a greater partnership on many issues, meal-to-meal, military-to-military dialogue and exchange, people-to-people, panda diplomacy, and anti-drug, as well as climate change partnership, etc. But we meet some difficulties. For this, China tried to blame the U.S., but in my personal view, China is also taking lessons from the consequences of such a competition. China is trying to moderate its position. So if Trump would assume his second term, I think China would take a more smart, more well-principled position in handling his second term. I think China would achieve better than his first term.
Ambassador Locke, may I ask you some geopolitical issues? Obviously, Taiwan is the red line for Beijing, and these two candidates have different views on that. The conventional wisdom is that Donald Trump, and he alluded to it in a Bloomberg Business Week interview, a month or so ago, that maybe Taiwan needs to pay for its own defense. So perhaps a Trump second administration will be less engaged internationally, whereas Kamala Harris, she co-sponsored the bill on human rights for Hong Kong. She has been, a supporter of Taiwan. Where do you see the two candidates as it positioned on that very sensitive issue of Taiwan, and what tack should they take?
Well, what you're seeing already from President Trump in his first administration and in his recent speeches is pulling back and reneging on a lot of the commitments that America has made to other countries. And so many world leaders are very concerned that President Trump, if he gets a second term, will really pursue almost an isolationist policy, not supporting Ukraine in its defense against the terrible invasion by Russia. And so many other countries, whether in Southeast Asia, Philippines, and other countries, are very worried about what a second-term Trump administration would do. That's why, in the past, all presidents, Democrats and Republicans, have reaffirmed their commitment of a one-China policy, but also defense of Taiwan to ensure that the matter is settled peacefully among the people of Taiwan and the mainland and not by force. And so you'll see President Kamala Harris adhering to that long-standing principle of stability, living up to our agreements, and supporting our allies.
Okay, I think we're just having some audio issues there. Professor Shen, on that very same question, if you could just chime in as well, how do you think this conversation around Taiwan evolves?
Well, China-U.S. have this perennial headache for each side. And I think both countries have rich experience and wisdom in handling this like what President Biden has said, to have to build a rail guard. But now the U.S. is pushing the envelope to send a military force into Taiwan, claiming they are for technical purpose, not for combating purpose. But this is a violation of U.S. commitment to China when the two countries established that diplomatic relationship in 1979. So U.S. need to understand that pushing the envelope eventually would possibly nurture a bigger escalation crisis. Therefore, Biden, Harris, or Trump second all need to work on this issue more cautiously, taking leadership in balancing the interest of America, a different interest group, especially those in the U.S. Congress, in order to truly build a guardrail. Despite our huge difference, the relationship would not be out of the rail.
Secretary Locke, apologies for interrupting you earlier on. I'd like to get your thoughts, too, on people-to-people exchanges. From your time as ambassador in China, we've seen a drop in the number of Americans working, living, studying in China. And I'm wondering whether you think both sides are now too far apart on that specific aspect on people-to-people exchanges. And I guess on the American side of the question here, do you think Americans should be scared of going to China, which is a view that's come out recently?
No, I don't think Americans should be afraid of going to China. In fact, we need more Americans and members of Congress visiting China to understand its history, its culture, the complexity of the issues they face. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair of Great Britain once said that diplomacy first starts with people-to-people exchange. We need to have more people going to China, studying as students, doing business, or even as tourists. The drop in the number of Americans visiting China is because of COVID, but also in terms of American employees in China. It's because of some of the crackdown in the policies, the invasive policies, the intrusions of the Chinese government into the affairs of private businesses. So there's a reluctance to expand in many areas, business opportunities in China, but we certainly need more people visiting China.